The morning had arrived with a kind of subdued calm that lingered in the air like fog before a storm. I stood at the foot of the bed, carefully folding the navy blue suit I'd planned to wear to Melissa's wedding. There was something ceremonial about the act, not because of the occasion itself, but because of how deliberately I found myself performing it. My hands smoothed the fabric with unnecessary care, as though I were preparing for a meeting of great consequence rather than a family gathering. He didn't speak. Her presence alone bore weight, like a ghost from a memory neither of us wanted to revisit. Her eyes were red, not from crying, but from holding back tears for far too long. Her face, normally composed in the quiet, determined way that made me fall in love with her, was pale, tense. I recognized the signs, though I couldn't name them yet. There's a way a person's body carries a secret before the mouth can shape the words: tighter shoulders, shallower breath, eyes that never quite meet yours. For years, I'd considered myself an observant man. My job in design required me to be sensitive to the nuances most people ignored: shadows, negative space, the emotional suggestion of color. That skill didn't always translate into marriage. I had missed more than I noticed over the years, brushed off small inconsistencies, dismissed long silences as tiredness or mood swings. But this time I could not turn away. Something about the tension in her silence demanded attention. She walked into the room slowly, sat down on the edge of the bed without a word, and stared at her hands. I waited, not out of patience, but instinct. Whatever was coming next needed room, space to unfold without the pressure of expectation. My mind tried to guess its shape. Maybe a family disagreement. Maybe a feeling of being overlooked by Melissa again. Maybe something petty or dramatic that would blow over once the wine began to pour at the reception. She didn't need to tell me not to come. Her entire body had already done it. Still, when she did speak, her voice was low, stripped of its usual tone, as if she had rehearsed the sentence 1,000 times in her mind and was just now giving herself permission to let it escape. And once it did, it sat between us, inert and full of implication. There was no anger in me, just confusion laced with a slow, rising unease. Her request was not rooted in frustration or resentment. It came from something deeper, something more vulnerable. It wasn't that she didn't want me there, it was that she couldn't bear for me to be there. And that distinction, delicate but sharp, cut through every theory I had about our life together. I went downstairs and made coffee, trying to keep my mind from spiraling. But the quiet in the house wrapped around me like cold linen. Every room seemed to echo with questions I had never asked. How long had she carried whatever this was? How many moments had we shared where she was only half present, her mind lost in a memory too painful to revisit, too dangerous to speak aloud? Marriage teaches you many things, some you learn slowly, others in a single crushing moment. That morning I realized how easily a secret could live between two people. It didn't need walls or closed doors. It just needed silence, and perhaps love's occasional laziness to dig deeper. I watched her from across the kitchen table as she sipped her tea, both hands cupped tightly around the mug like it might float away. She wasn't avoiding me out of guilt. It was something else. Fear, perhaps, or the heaviness of someone who had seen a version of the world I couldn't yet imagine. I realized I'd been living with someone who had managed to compartmentalize her life so well that even I had failed to see the fracture beneath the surface. The decision not to go to the wedding had already been made for me, though she never phrased it that way. I could see it in the way her fingers trembled, the way she couldn't meet my eyes when I asked questions she never answered. Whatever was waiting for her at that ceremony was too powerful to be contained within the boundaries of celebration. And whatever role I played in her life, it was clear that my presence would make something unravel. Or worse, reveal something long buried. I told her I understood, though I didn't. I told her I'd stay behind, though I didn't want to. I told myself it was nothing, though everything about it felt monumental. There's a specific kind of helplessness that comes when someone you love is hurting and refuses to let you in. It's not anger you feel, it's absence. A presence that pulls away just enough for you to feel the space they used to fill. That weekend, I watched her leave for the wedding alone. She wore a dress I'd never seen before, something elegant and muted, and her makeup was flawless in a way that almost seemed strategic. Like armor. She smiled at me before she stepped out the door, and the smile was the most dishonest thing I'd ever seen on her face. I returned it anyway, because sometimes when you love someone, you lie back. The hours that followed felt suspended as though time had been stretched. I busied myself with small tasks. I reorganized a bookshelf. I swept the porch. I cooked a meal I didn't eat. Every moment was filled with the echo of a question I hadn't yet dared to ask. What exactly was she protecting me from? I opened a photo album we hadn't touched in years. There was Emily in college, her hair a little longer, her smile more unguarded. Melissa was there, too, always a little louder, more commanding, more comfortable in her own skin. In every picture, Emily stood slightly off-center, as though she preferred the edge of things. I hadn't noticed that before. A wave of discomfort hit me, not because of the photos themselves, but because I realized I didn't know the story behind them. I had loved a version of Emily that she had carefully curated, and I had accepted that version, never pushing too hard when she flinched at certain names or avoided certain topics. By late evening, I was restless. I tried calling her, but the call went straight to voicemail. I told myself there was nothing to worry about, that she was probably busy helping with last-minute details or sitting through long toasts and family chaos. But beneath that reasoning was a growing knot of dread. I didn't know what had happened to her in the past, but I knew it had followed her into that wedding hall like a shadow. The night dragged on. I sat on the couch watching the hour hand past midnight, wondering if she would come home the same or changed, wondering if this silence was temporary or the beginning of something permanent. I stared at my own hands, now clenched, and thought about the weight of not knowing, of not asking sooner, of trusting too blindly. By the time I heard the key turn in the lock, it was nearly 2 in the morning. I didn't move. I let her walk in first, coat slung over her arm, shoes in hand. She didn't look at me as she passed by, just climbed the stairs quietly. And I knew then that whatever had happened at the wedding had not resolved the pain, but reawakened it. Upstairs, I heard the soft click of the bathroom door and the gentle running of water. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back. Something had cracked. A fracture long hidden beneath the floorboards of our life together had begun to split wider. And though I couldn't yet see its full depth, I could feel the air changing. Heavier, more fragile, unforgiving. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to her breathe beside me, every breath a reminder that sometimes, even in the closest of marriages, the real battle is not what's said aloud, but what remains buried, and what that silence eventually costs. The morning after the wedding began as if the world had no memory of the night before. The sun rose politely, indifferent to what had happened within the walls of our home, or what had quietly unraveled between us. I remained in bed long after she had risen. I heard her footsteps on the floorboards, her careful movement in the kitchen, her attempt to navigate the morning as if nothing had happened. There was something painful in her restraint. She was trying to protect me from a truth I had not asked for, but now desperately needed. I could no longer ignore the shape of the thing between us. It had a name, a story, a beginning. I just didn't know what they were yet. When I finally came downstairs, the table had already been cleared. A cup of tea, untouched and now lukewarm, sat where mine would have been. She had set a place for me out of habit or guilt, I wasn't sure. I stood behind the chair and stared at the empty cup for a long time. She wasn't in the room anymore. She had drifted somewhere into the house, maybe into herself. I spent the rest of the day moving through the motions of life, but detached from them. I cleaned out the garage, sorted tools that didn't need sorting, checked emails I'd already read. Anything to keep from circling back to the only question that mattered. Who was the man she was afraid of? I no longer believed it was about a family quarrel. The tremble in her hands, the avoidance in her eyes, the hollow sound of her voice, those things weren't born from mere discomfort. As the day slipped into evening, I began to replay the timeline of her life. What had she left behind before we met? I thought I knew. She detold me about college, about early jobs, about a childhood that was happy enough but complicated by parental pressure. But those stories had always been told with a certain sheen, polished over time, made acceptable by distance and summary. What hadn't she told me? What was the detail she had edited out to preserve the version of herself she thought I could love? I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat in the den with the lights off. The glow from the hallway barely reached me, which suited the mood I was sinking into. I wasn't angry, not yet, but I was unsettled. My mind, usually analytical and grounded, had started to fill in blanks with speculation. That never ends well. Still, I let it. I let my imagination wander through all the possible truths she might be hiding, even the most unlikely ones. But I couldn't guess this one. All I had were fragments. Her sudden plea, her trembling body, her avoidance of eye contact when Mr. Lancaster's name had come up in passing a few months back. I had forgotten the moment, filed it under stress. Now it returned, vivid and electric with new meaning. I hadn't met him, Melissa's fiancé's father, a man spoken of only in titles, investor, philanthropist, board member, but not once had Emily referred to him by name. At the time, I hadn't thought anything of it. She was never much interested in Melissa's social circle, but now I couldn't help but feel the weight of the omission. Not naming him had been the first act of self-preservation. That's how people deal with trauma sometimes. Later that night, when she went to bed early without a word, I stayed behind and opened her old storage box. It was tucked away in the guest room closet, something I hadn't touched since we moved into this house. It was mostly full of papers, photographs, old journals, and course materials from her college years. I didn't open it to spy. I opened it because I had to. What I found wasn't proof, but atmosphere. An unmistakable mood ran through the artifacts. Photos of her and classmates, none of whom I recognized. A few taken at formal dinners in company boardrooms, smiling with people who looked too old to be her peers. And then just one that made my stomach turn. A picture of her standing beside a man in a tuxedo, older, powerful, his arm resting too casually around her shoulder. Her smile was polite, but her eyes were not smiling. I stared at that photo for a long time. The back of it bore no note, but it didn't need one. I knew in my gut this was the man she didn't want me to see. The man who was at the wedding. The man whose presence alone had been enough to send my wife into a spiral of silence and fear. I finally had a face, and now that I did, the story began to write itself. I returned the photo to the box and closed the lid. I didn't confront her, not yet. I wasn't sure what confronting would even mean. This wasn't a matter of trust anymore. It was a matter of damage, her damage, and maybe mine now too. I lay awake for hours that night, watching the ceiling as though it held answers in the plaster. I heard her breathing next to me, steady and soft, but I knew she wasn't asleep. We were both pretending. The next day, I told her I needed to go into the city. I lied. I went to the wedding venue. I wanted to see it with my own eyes, not the ceremony which had already passed, but the place, the layout, the table arrangements, the people who lingered afterward for brunch and farewells. I wore plain clothes, stood at a distance, acted like someone lost or curious. I watched faces. I studied interactions, and then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of a patio, talking with Melissa's fiancé and two other men, perfectly polished, commanding without trying. He exuded wealth in the way only the most dangerous men do, like it wasn't money but gravity. I didn't approach. I didn't need to. I already knew too much. His presence confirmed everything I feared, and still he laughed like a man who had never once suffered consequence. It was then I noticed something else, Emily's posture in the background of this scene. She was there after all. Sitting quietly on a bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her back straight, her eyes locked on the floor. She wasn't a guest at a celebration. She was a prisoner passing time in someone else's story. She looked older, smaller, like the years between then and now had collapsed in one afternoon, and I hated him for that. I hated myself for not knowing sooner. I drove home without speaking to anyone. The house felt colder when I returned, not physically, just spiritually. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood there holding it for far too long. She came downstairs sometime later, her face pale, her eyes glassy. She looked at me, and for the first time in days I could tell she wanted to speak. But she didn't. She sat at the table, folded her hands, and stared ahead. So I sat too, across from her, two people holding different pieces of the same broken mirror. I didn't need her to say anything that night. I knew what she would tell me eventually, and I knew it would break something. But I also knew this. No matter how dark her past, I would not let her face it alone. Even if I had to walk through it blind. The days that followed unfolded with the strange stillness of something unfinished. We went about our routines as if the world outside our home had not shifted, as if we were simply returning to the quiet rhythm of domestic life. But beneath every gesture, every glance, every silence at the dinner table, there was a hum, subtle but persistent. It was the sound of something trying to resurface. A memory, a truth, a wound. She tried to pretend nothing had changed, and I let her, at least on the surface. But my mind was not idle. I kept returning to that man's face, his laugh, his confidence, his effortless command of the space around him like a king surveying his kingdom. But what haunted me most wasn't him, it was her posture as she watched him, the way she shrank inward, the way her body spoke what her mouth refused to say. I found myself retracing her life in pieces. I looked through old photographs again, reread her university thesis, glanced through notes she had left in margins of old notebooks. There was no confession, no obvious sign, but I began to understand something more powerful than words. Trauma rarely announces itself clearly. It hides in details and absence in what is never quite said. I remembered the first time she had mentioned her internship at Lancaster Capital, years ago before I even knew who that man was. It had been in passing, just a footnote in a larger story about her college struggles. Dee said she hated the corporate world, said it drained her. I had thought it was the stress of working under pressure, the imposter syndrome that so many young professionals feel. I never considered that it might be something more insidious. I thought about the way she never attended alumni events, how she never replied to emails from former classmates, how she blocked a number once after it showed up on her phone without telling me why. It had seemed like a strange but harmless boundary at the time, but now I knew better. Those were signals, and I, in my blind affection, had mistaken them for quirks of personality. One night after she had gone to bed, I walked out into the backyard and stood barefoot in the grass. The moon was high, casting a cold, silver light over everything. I looked up not for answers, but for distance. I needed to feel small, needed to be reminded that some truths stretch beyond comprehension, that not everything broken can be made whole again with words or time. My thoughts returned to her family, to Melissa. I began to wonder what Melissa knew. If anything, had she seen what Emily had endured? Had she ignored it? Or had Emily never told her at all? That seemed likely. Shame, after all, is a master of isolation. It convinces the wounded to stay silent, to protect others from the darkness they carry. I began to suspect that Emily had spent years not just trying to forget, but trying to forgive herself for not saying anything. The next morning, I left the house early and drove. I didn't know exactly where I was going until I found myself parked outside the old university campus where she had studied. It had been more than a decade since she'd walked those halls, but I hoped the ghosts of that time still lingered in corners she had tried to forget. I walked through the main quadrangle, past the administration building, and toward the business faculty offices. I didn't know what I was looking for: an office, a plaque, a name, but what I found was more abstract. The walls were lined with photos of graduating classes. One of them caught my eye, her class, a sea of smiles, and there she was, third row from the back, smile soft, eyes guarded. I stayed there a long time, watching that photo as if it might blink or shift. Eventually, a janitor walked past me and nodded. I nodded back. I must have looked like someone searching for his own history. In a way, I was, because the more I learned about what had happened to her, the more I realized it had shaped everything about us. Her silences, her cautious love, even the way she held me sometimes like she was afraid I might shatter too. On my way out, I stopped by the small memorial garden near the law school. I sat on a bench and let the wind carry my thoughts. I didn't blame her, not for the silence, not for the fear, not for the years of omission. I blamed the man who had made her afraid in the first place, the man who had stolen something sacred and left her to bury the ruins. That evening, when I returned home, I found her in the study, sitting with her knees drawn to her chest. The room was dim. A single lamp cast a warm glow over her face, making her look younger somehow, as if I were seeing the version of her that existed before the hurt. She didn't look at me, but she knew I was there. I could feel it in the tension of her shoulders. I sat down across from her, not saying a word. There was nothing to say yet. What needed to happen was not conversation, it was presence, a witness, a quiet kind of solidarity. In that moment, I realized that she didn't need answers from me. She didn't need comfort. What she needed was permission, permission to speak, permission to unravel, permission to let her pain be real in front of someone else. But the words didn't come, not that night. She eventually stood, walked past me, and went to bed, and I followed. Not as a husband expecting intimacy or reconciliation, but as a guardian of silence, willing to wait as long as it took. The next day, I found a letter. It was in her handwriting, folded carefully inside a book of poetry she kept beside the bed. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but I knew it was meant for me. She hadn't given it to me, but she had placed it where I would find it. And that, in its own way, was an invitation. I read it slowly, each line carrying the weight of years she had spent trying to forget. She described her first day at Lancaster Capital, how she had felt proud, accomplished, hopeful, how that hope had slowly eroded as the weeks went on, the way he looked at her in meetings, the way his hand would linger too long on her back, the private lunch he insisted on scheduling, the wine, the locked door, the way she had pushed him away and fled, shoes in hand, heart pounding. She had told no one, not the police, not her parents, not her sister. She had feared not being believed, feared being blamed, feared losing her internship, her recommendation, her future. And she had been right. A week later, she was removed from the project due to restructuring. Her emails went unanswered. Her supervisor stopped speaking to her. She left quietly, changed majors, buried the story. I read her words again and again. Each time I felt a new layer of sorrow, not just for what had happened to her, but for the way it had shaped everything since. Her avoidance of weddings, her distrust of powerful men, the way she flinched when I raised my voice, even in frustration, all of it made sense now. That night I stood by the window while she slept. I looked out at the street, calm and ordinary, and wondered how many other women walked through the world carrying stories like hers. Stories no one had asked to hear. Stories they had learned to package in politeness and professionalism. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know if she would want to speak about it, or if she ever could. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity: I would never allow that man to live his life untouched by what he had done. Not anymore. Silence had protected him long enough. And I knew now that my place wasn't just beside her. It was between her and the memory of him. Between her and the lies the world had forced her to believe. I couldn't undo the past, but I could make sure it never claimed another day of her future without resistance. In that quiet resolve, something shifted inside me. A line had been crossed, but not by her, by him. And I would no longer be complicit in keeping that line hidden in shadow. There are moments in life when silence becomes unbearable, not because of its weight, but because of what it begins to demand. After reading her letter, I could no longer pretend to be an audience member in a story I had unknowingly walked into years ago. That letter had shifted something in me. I wasn't angry with her. I was angry at the space that had been carved between us, shaped not by choice but by survival. And I was angry at the man who had carved it, who had built a reputation out of polished charm and connections while leaving the evidence of his violations buried in the silence of women like my wife. Over the next several days, my thoughts evolved from sorrow to conviction. I had never been a man of confrontation. I preferred order, logic, resolution. But this situation required something else, disruption. It required an act of refusal to accept the lie, refusal to let her carry the burden alone, refusal to let him walk through life untouched by the truth. I began with research, not on her, on him. His face, now burned into my mind from the wedding, led me down a long trail of public records, business articles, interviews, and fundraisers. He was everywhere. Photos shaking hands with governors, posing beside new wings of hospitals his foundation had helped fund, receiving honorary degrees at prestigious universities. But the deeper I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Every appearance was carefully managed, every public statement rehearsed. But in that perfection, I found the flaw. Buried in old finance records, I noticed the abrupt resignation of 3 junior female staffers from his company within months of each other, during the year Emily had interned. No public explanation, no formal complaints on record, just silence and severance. I found a vague alumni blog post from one of the women, later deleted, that hinted at something darker within the upper ranks of Lancaster Capital. I stared at the screen for a long time after finding it, the weight of Emily's story now multiplied. She hadn't been the only one, just one of many. And like the others, she had been erased, replaced, reshuffled into silence. It was then that I made the decision. Melissa's wedding had come and gone, but there was to be a follow-up gathering, a reception dinner hosted by the groom's family at one of the high-end hotels downtown. It was a final celebration for close friends and business associates. Emily had opted not to attend, claiming fatigue. I told her I understood. She smiled weakly, but I had no intention of staying behind. The night of the dinner, I dressed not for confrontation but for precision. I wore my best tailored suit, the one I rarely touched, the one reserved for courtrooms or investor summits. I wanted no mistakes in perception. I wanted no one to dismiss me as emotional or irrational. I needed to be deliberate, controlled, surgical. The hotel ballroom was a shrine to opulence. Chandeliers sparkled like constellations, walls draped in cream fabric, waiters moving in coordinated silence. I moved through the crowd with ease. These were the same circles I had walked in before, though for very different reasons. I shook a few hands, offered vague nods, declined champagne. I was not there to celebrate. I spotted him near the head table, engaged in quiet conversation with a state senator. He wore confidence like cologne, thick, inescapable, offensive. He laughed too easily, touched arms too familiarly, performed charisma with a kind of oily grace that made my stomach tighten. But I didn't approach him then. Not yet. Instead, I waited for the dinner to begin. I took my seat across the room, close enough to observe but far enough to remain unacknowledged. Speeches were made, toasts given, plates clinked, laughter echoed. And then he rose to speak. He took the stage like a seasoned actor, thanked the guests, praised his son, congratulated Melissa, and offered a charming monologue about love, legacy, and leadership. His words were calculated to inspire and disarm. People leaned in. Smiles widened. It was the performance of a man who believed his past had no shadow. I waited until the applause faded before I stood. There was a microphone set up near the center aisle, ostensibly for guests who wished to share memories. I walked toward it slowly, calmly, aware of every eye turning to follow me. I felt the heat of their curiosity, the murmur of questions. But I didn't rush. I didn't tremble. I introduced myself with measured clarity, not as Emily's husband, but by my full name, my credentials, my professional standing. I made it clear I belonged in that room, financially, socially, intellectually. Then, with the same clarity, I turned my words toward him. I spoke not with accusation, but with narrative. I told the room a story of a young intern, of power abused, of silence purchased. I never named Emily. I didn't need to. I painted the portrait with care, each detail selected to provoke memory, to stir discomfort, to chip away at the marble facade he had spent decades polishing. At first, the room held its breath. Then came the shifting of chairs, the glances exchanged, the tension rising like pressure in a sealed room. And finally, I looked at him. Not with anger, not with fear, but with the calm certainty of someone who had seen the truth behind the costume. He didn't speak. His expression froze somewhere between confusion and recognition. I could see the math happening in his head, calculating what I knew, what I could prove, what others might now begin to suspect. His face betrayed nothing, but his eyes gave him away. For the first time, I saw them flicker. I ended my speech with no demand, no threat, just the truth laid bare, and then I stepped down. I left before dessert was served. Back at home, Emily was asleep, or at least lying still enough to seem that way. I changed in silence, climbed into bed, and stared at the ceiling. My heart wasn't racing, it was steady. There was no victory in what I had done, no justice, not really, but there was something else, a fracture in the silence, a breach in the narrative he had built. The next morning there were emails, one from Melissa, one from a woman I didn't know who thanked me for saying what no one else had, another from a lawyer asking to speak off the record. Whispers had begun, cracks had formed. His legend was no longer pristine. Emily didn't ask me what I had done, but she looked at me differently, not with suspicion, not with anger, but with something closer to recognition, as if she had seen me for the first time in years, as if I had finally stepped into the place beside her, not just in love, but in truth. That afternoon we sat together on the porch. No words passed between us. We didn't need them. For the first time in a long time, silence wasn't hiding anything. It was just quiet. And in that quiet, something inside both of us began to heal. Some moments arrive not with thunder, but with a quietness so complete that you feel them more than you hear them. In the days that followed the dinner, the world around me seemed unusually still. The leaves outside didn't rustle. The air barely moved. The clocks ticked more slowly, as though time itself had become aware of the weight pressing on our house. But something had changed. It was subtle, like the soft creaking of a structure adjusting to a shift in its foundation. Emily moved more slowly, but also more purposefully. She was no longer shrinking from her own home. Instead, she moved through the rooms like someone testing whether the walls were still hers. Her eyes no longer darted away when I looked at her. She had not yet spoken of what I had done at the dinner, but her silence now felt like acknowledgement, not avoidance. I watched her closely, not with suspicion, but with reverence. I was seeing the rebuilding of a woman, not all at once, not triumphantly, but carefully, layer by layer. The guilt she had carried like a second skin was beginning to crack, and from those cracks came something delicate, like sunlight returning to a long-abandoned room. I hadn't expected the aftermath to be so quiet. I thought there might be confrontation, retaliation, some sort of public defense from him or his handlers, but there was nothing. Just rumors circulating quietly through the channels that polite society uses when it wants to acknowledge a scandal without admitting complicity. His name began to appear less frequently. Invitations once extended were now rescinded. His quotes were pulled from websites. A foundation gala was postponed indefinitely. One morning, while reading the news, I came across an op-ed written by a journalist who had heard about the dinner speech. The article didn't mention names but dissected the culture of silence in powerful institutions. It spoke of the courage it takes to speak when others benefit from your silence. It spoke of survivors and of those who stand beside them not to rescue, but to witness, to honor, to validate. I clipped the article and left it on her nightstand. My phone began to ring more frequently. Some calls I answered. Others I let go to voicemail. Journalists looking for a quote. Former employees asking if they could share their own stories. A university professor wanting to revisit a disciplinary hearing from years ago. It was as if my one act had ripped a seam, and now people were crawling through the opening, desperate to finally speak. But what occupied my heart most was her, Emily, and the slow transformation I witnessed in her. One afternoon, I found her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt replanting herbs she'd once neglected. She was covered in soil, hair pulled back messily, her brow furrowed, not with stress, but with focus. It was the most alive I had seen her in years, not because she was doing anything grand, but because she was doing something for herself, something that required presence. Her hands were no longer trembling. That night, for the first time since the wedding, she lay down beside me without turning her back. Her breathing was steady, her hand rested on my chest. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of 1,000 confessions. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply allowed her to return to the space she had long ago withdrawn from, and in doing so, I felt something release in me, too. I realized then how much of our marriage had been shaped by what she hadn't said, and how much I had allowed that silence to define us. Not out of cruelty, not even out of ignorance, but out of convenience. Because sometimes love makes us complacent. We settle into comfort and mistake it for intimacy. We accept surface peace, never asking what storms might be raging beneath. In the weeks that followed, Emily began writing. Not for publication, not for anyone else, just for herself. Pages would appear on the kitchen counter, folded sheets tucked into books, sentences scribbled on napkins. I never read them unless she handed them to me. But when she did, I read them slowly, absorbing each word like scripture. They were stories not just of what happened to her, but of how she had survived it, of how she had carried it, of how it had changed her. One entry struck me in particular. She described a moment from college, shortly after the incident, when she had sat in the university library staring at a book but unable to read. She wrote about the way the words blurred, the way her heart raced for no reason. She described walking back to her dorm and crying in the stairwell, afraid to go inside, afraid to exist. But the last line of that entry stayed with me most. I wanted someone to see me without asking me to explain. That sentence became my compass. I stopped asking her what she needed. I simply tried to be there. I made space for her to grieve the version of herself she had lost. I didn't try to fix anything. I didn't offer solutions. I listened when she wanted to speak. I sat beside her when she didn't. I honored the silence when it returned, not as a barrier, but as a balm. Eventually, the world caught up. A former intern filed a formal complaint with the board of Lancaster Capital. Another came forward with supporting testimony. A podcast episode aired featuring survivors speaking anonymously. The whispers became louder. His name, once synonymous with influence, was now attached to questions. Investigations were launched. A firm that had once proudly boasted his image on its website now scrubbed it clean. Through it all, Emily watched with the measured calm of someone who had seen it all before. She didn't rejoice. She didn't rage. She simply observed. Because she knew something the rest of the world was only now learning, that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they stand in the light, smiling, shaking hands, pretending to be pillars of the community. And she had outlived his power. One evening I came home to find her burning something in the fireplace. Old documents, letters, printed emails, physical reminders of the past. She didn't look up when I entered the room. She just sat there, watching the pages curl and blacken, her face illuminated by the quiet glow. I stood beside her, not to stop her, not to question her, but simply to be near. When the flames died down, she turned toward me. Her face was wet, but her eyes were clear. For the first time, I saw a version of Emily that felt whole, not because the pain was gone, but because she had finally stopped carrying it alone. That night we sat on the back steps, wrapped in a single blanket, listening to the wind move through the trees. It was autumn now, leaves falling without resistance. The world, it seemed, was finally letting go. There is no precise moment when healing begins. It does not announce itself with fireworks or milestones. It creeps in quietly, through routine, through breath, through the soft reshaping of memory. I used to believe healing was a destination, a final chapter where the pain ended and everything made sense. After the fire in the fireplace, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. Emily didn't suddenly beam with joy or walk lighter as though a spell had been broken. But there was a clarity to her now, an unspoken confidence in how she took up space. She no longer moved as though apologizing for it. She no longer treated herself like a visitor in her own life. She began waking early, not because of nightmares, but because she wanted to. She would sit by the window with her tea, the sun rising over her shoulder, and write. She rarely showed me what she wrote now. That didn't bother me. I knew the act itself mattered more than the content, the act of reclaiming voice, of turning inward and not finding a void. Outside our home, the world kept spinning with a strange sense of delayed justice. The man who had once terrified her, the man who had built empires on charm and intimidation, was now facing public scrutiny. Lawsuits were pending, donations were being returned. His name, once stamped in gold across marble plaques and university wings, was being removed, slowly, almost reluctantly. Institutions are always slow to disown the powerful, but the momentum was irreversible. I didn't speak publicly again. I didn't need to. Others had found their voices now. Other women, other stories. What once felt like a solitary scream in a quiet room had become a chorus. Survivors stepping into the light one after the other, not for applause, not for pity, but for reclamation, for dignity, for truth. And it was beautiful, it was heartbreaking, it was necessary. Emily never joined the interviews. She declined the offers, the article proposals, the podcasts. She wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. She had been a secret for so long she didn't want to become a spectacle. Her battle wasn't for the world, it was for herself. For the girl she once was. For the woman she had become despite it all. That choice, too, I respected. Instead, she taught. She returned to the classroom with a renewed sense of purpose. Her students, unaware of her journey, responded instinctively to her presence. I watched her prepare lesson plans with joy I hadn't seen in years. There was power in that, too. Power in reclaiming joy without apology. Power in deciding that survival doesn't have to look like struggle every day. I continued my work as well, but with different eyes. I had changed. My understanding of pain, of silence, of resilience, everything had deepened. My relationships with people shifted, too. I listened more. I questioned more. I left less unsaid, because now I knew how much could be buried in the quiet, and how costly that quiet could become. One afternoon in early winter, we received a letter, handwritten, carefully folded. It was from one of the women who had come forward after the dinner speech. She didn't name herself, but she spoke of gratitude, of how hearing the story told aloud gave her the courage to name her own. She wrote about her daughter, whom she had never told. And now, after years, she finally had. She thanked us not for speaking, but for beginning something. Emily read the letter in silence. When she finished, she placed it in her journal and closed the cover without a word. That evening, she left the house with a quiet determination. I didn't ask where she was going. I knew better than to interrupt what was sacred. She returned after dark, her cheeks pink from the cold, her eyes glassy from the wind or something more. She hung her coat, made tea, and sat beside me without explanation. But I felt it, the closure. The visit she had made, perhaps to a place or a person or a version of herself. I didn't need the details. I simply sat with her, shoulder to shoulder, the space between us no longer carrying ghosts. That winter passed gently. Snow fell in soft layers, blanketing the neighborhood in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than before. Not heavy, not suffocating, peaceful, restorative. We walked more, talked more. We didn't dissect the past anymore. It had found its place, not forgotten, not forgiven, but no longer untended. Our marriage began to feel new again, not in the way of first love, but in the way of deep trust, of survival, of choosing one another with full knowledge of what lay beneath. There was an honesty between us now that had not existed before, and with it, a tenderness I hadn't expected. Love, when it includes the broken parts, becomes something fierce, something profound. In spring we traveled, not far, just a few days along the coast. We walked cliffs and watched waves crash below. We held hands without urgency. We said little but felt much. One morning she stood by the water with her shoes in her hand, wind tearing through her hair, eyes closed, face turned upward. I watched her from a distance and thought, this is what freedom looks like, not loud, not defiant, just unburdened. She smiled more now, not all the time, but when she did, it reached her eyes. I often wondered what might have happened if I had listened to her plea and stayed away from the wedding, if I had respected her fear without challenging its roots. Would she still be walking in the shadows of her own life? Would I still be blind to the weight she carried? There's no way to know, but I do know this: love demands more than comfort. It demands presence, patience, courage, especially in the face of what cannot be undone. Looking back, I no longer see the man who once stood before her and asked why she didn't want me to come. That man didn't understand the magnitude of what silence can protect or conceal, but I became someone else through that journey, someone better, not because I saved her, but because I stood still long enough to truly see her. Our story didn't end with confrontation or victory. It ended with return, with a woman returning to her voice, with a man returning to awareness, with two people returning to each other, not as saviors, but as witnesses. The world outside keeps moving. New scandals rise, new stories unfold, but inside our home the air is still, and in that stillness I sometimes hear it, that soft, almost imperceptible sound. The sound of breaking silence. And it sounds like freedom,